All right, so last class I was trying to give you some ideas, and today we will spend some time in teams, hopefully getting your project selected here. There are a lot of projects related to EVs. It could just be buying an EV. I already told you my project, I actually think plug-in hybrids are better than EVs, but you could do that analysis. The EVs charging station is one people have done before. That you'd have to look at the bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and see what's in there because it probably has gotten better. Tesla is trying to get these things all over the country, but you're hearing a lot of people with some frustration with that. So those are the kind of ideas we'll talk more today. I keep hoping someone will do the Longberg idea. I've had, what I like about this is he's got everything you need. You really just have to take his report and put it into a format and then do some other research. He's a pretty interesting guy. So I've been amazed when you call people like this, as famous as he is, or email them, they're like more than happy to talk to you. It's just amazing. I had one case we tried, which just didn't work. We couldn't get the data, but should we be putting drug addicts in prison or should we do rehab? So the question was, is society better off rather than putting people in prison, putting in rehab certain types of people? And so the question was, how much it costs for someone to be in prison versus how much is rehab? So I actually called the Cato Institute because they do stuff like that all the time. And they said, great question. We have no data on that. I was like, well, if you don't have data on it, no one has data. So it was a really, really tough question to answer. One of our students from China, she did a cost benefit analysis in the China Olympics. And I told her there's no way you're going to find data. And she did an incredibly good cost benefit analysis. So you can do these bigger ones. I've had some teams do ones that just didn't work. One did the high-speed train in East Texas, and you just can't get the data. It's just, so that's one of the things we're going to think of. It's a really hard project if you can't get the data. I love the idea of, is it better to put people in prison or put them in rehab, is from a societal standpoint. I love the question. I wish we'd talk about it more, but if you can't get the data, you're going to have a tough time doing it. So that's the reason I like Lomborg, is that they've done the work. They have several projects there where they did all the work. You just have to go in and try to update it and look at it. Some on education. The biggest medical issues in the world are tuberculosis and malaria. He has a lot of data on those. Tuberculosis is one in particular where hundreds of thousands of people die every year, and it's probably something that you could solve, and he has all the data, so it's interesting stuff. So those are there. All right, we'll get into that. We'll do that here later. Just a few closing notes on this. A lot of firms like to have categories on cost benefit just because they want certain projects to get approved really fast and get through the system fast. So there's some that you're required to do because of law or regulation. And their thought is, hey, let's don't spend a lot of time on those. Let's just get it approved and get it done. OSHA might come up with some requirement. Some people say the cost benefit might be to violate the law and just accept the penalties. I had one guy in my class, his idea was San Antonio had a water restriction. So his idea was, I'm just going to ignore it because the penalties for watering your yard are less than keeping my yard alive. That was his argument. And everybody in class is like, yeah, we're going to turn you in, whatever. But that was his argument, is, hey, I'll just keep watering my yard. If a neighbor turns me in, big deal. I'll still protect my yard and pay a few $100. Probably the best ones and the one you'll do are cost savings. Replacing old equipment, replacing software, cost savings, those are pretty popular. Why? Because they're typically you have more confidence in the numbers that they really, really work out. And this is where you can get creative. I remember one project I had where we were paying a custodial bank $500,000 a year. And it's not really a cost benefit analysis, but my boss was like, well, should we change banks? And I said, well, no one wants to. It's a lot of work. But there was no studies on custodial banks. So we didn't know what was expensive or cheap. So I went out to 10 banks and I said, we're not looking for a new bank, but we're doing a survey on custodial fees because no one had any data. And so the banks didn't know what the competition was. So I just said, hey, we're just doing the survey. We'll send you our book of business and then we'll share all the information with you, except for not with the bank information. And all those banks shared all the information. What were they hoping? That we were still going to change banks. So they were still pushing me, but I said, no, we're not changing banks. Well, we found out our bank was like $300,000 overcharging us. And they cut their bills immediately. I was like, okay, boss, I just paid my salary for the rest of my stay here. You can give me a big bonus. It was really simple. So you're just looking, how can we save money? What kind of ideas are out there? And there's all kind of things you can do. Customer service ones are a little tougher because it's really hard to know what the benefit is. Are they actually going to buy more product? Or, the biggest thing, I worked at USAA. The big thing on USAA is lapse rates. That's the same thing with Netflix. USAA, we're just talking about life insurance. USAA selling a new life insurance product is extremely expensive. You have to do blood tests, medical tests, all this stuff. It costs you a lot of money. You can't sell that product and then they cancel it a year later because you lose a lot of money. But USA has one of the lowest lapse rates in the industry, gives them a huge advantage. What can you do to keep that lapse rate down? What does Netflix do to keep its lapse rate down? Pretty expensive, isn't it? They got to produce new shows. Have they done anything here recently with the strike? I don't use, what is Netflix? What's the big thing on Netflix now? I haven't had Netflix in a couple of years. Are y'all driving the Netflix? Is that your big thing or not? Or Disney or?
We put them on like fast food sharing film.
Yeah, I know that probably kicked most college students out. So that's the lapse rate. So how much does it cost you to keep a customer if you can keep them on a cheap weight? Facebook has done those things where they have something interesting every year, some kind of memory share or something. How much does it cost to do that versus how many customers do you lose? So that's tough. Or what can you do to increase your customer base, reducing lost customers? Expansion and diversification, these are the huge ones that you do with a major project. You're going to spend a lot of time working on these. Are you going to move into new markets? Are you going to buy a competitor? Those are things you're not going to do spending 10 minutes or a couple of hours working on. A lot of firms have a department that just do that. Some firms, acquisitions is a big part of their business, and so they do that. USA did not have an acquisitions department until after I left. They started one. I don't know exactly what that team's doing. USA is not a big acquirer, but if you're going to do something like move into China or move into Africa or whatever, you're going to spend a lot of time on that because if you're wrong, you're just going to spend a fortune and have to shut it all down. I was listening. The Economist had an article on firms that shut down in Russia and how much that cost them. And a lot of firms haven't. They've just quietly keep doing it and hoping no one notices because they have 5-10% of their revenues are coming from Russia. They feel like they have no choice, but they keep going. But those are expensive. You go in and you fail, it's going to be pretty expensive. And then diversification, just, again, expanding your business into new markets or new products. All right, we already talked about the models. Anybody remember the DCF rule? You accept if what? If your net present value is what? What was the rule there? Y'all did the equal if. You remember what you did in Excel?
Greater than 0?
Greater than or equal to 0. So if your net present value is $2, that may not be that large, but that means you're making your cost of capital. You're making a big enough return to cover your cost of capital. Any net present value greater than 0 means the value of the firm is going up by that net present value. So that's why you choose positive projects. What about, well, we'll come back to those. What about the discounted payback? What's the rule there? It's whatever you say it is. Now, what are you going to do on your project on discounted payback? No rule, right? You're just going to calculate it and look at it, but you don't need to set up a rule in advance. You're just going to talk through it. Anybody remember the rule for IRR? You accept if the IRR is what? Can you visualize what you did with the equal if? All right, so the accept is you have to do this on the exams, so you probably remember it for exam 2, not exam 1. If your IRR is greater than your cost of capital, then you accept. So if your cost of capital is 5%, your IRR is 8%, then you accept. Is it possible for MPV to reject an IRR to accept? Extremely rare. It has to be a really bizarre project. So usually you get the same answer. If MPV is positive, IRR is almost always going to be greater than your cost of capital. Okay. We do have some issues we're not going to deal with, but what if you have 10 projects and you got to pick, you only have enough money to do 6 of them? Which ones do you pick? And let me just tell you, I don't care what your textbooks say, there is no good answer for that. It just really is not easy to do. So the NPV rule, the final rule is what most people say is pick the project with the highest net present value, but that's not always the case. So in capital rationing, you say pick the project. Let me just maybe give you some examples. You say you have project A, it has an NPV, say of 50,000. And project B has an NPV, say of 20,000. Project C is an NPV 30,000. Which I'm sorry, let me say 40,000. Which project do you pick? Sounds like A, but what if the cost of this one is $1 million? The cost of this one is 400,000. Cost of this one is 450,000. Now what would you do? If you have $1 million budget, you can do A, but what else could you do? You could do B and C. How many combinations are there, or how many projects do you have? And how do you possibly figure out the best combination? So what you actually have to do is take every single project, its cost, its net present value, you look at every single possible combination, and then you want the highest NPV overall. But it doesn't work. And why doesn't it work? Because these 3 projects don't all show up on the same day in the year. They show up all throughout the year. You got 3 projects, 10 projects, 12 projects. It's an absolute mess. I don't know any firm that has really solved this problem. It's really quite messy what to do. So if your budget's $1 million, you probably should spend it on those 2, and that still leaves you with an extra 150,000 you could spend on another project. So B and C would be the superior one. So you can't just say pick the project with the highest NPV, because there can be better solutions out there. That's called capital rationing. And again, I don't think any firm out there has ever come up with a good solution. One thing people have tried is something called a profitability index, which what the profitability index says is compare the NPV to the cost and look at that ratio. And you want the one that gives you the best NPV versus cost. So that might be a solution, but even that won't always give you the best answer. So it's just a mess. But NPV does look at alternative opportunities, and it can kind of give you an idea. It doesn't give you a perfect answer. NPV does consider risk, because your discount rate should cover risk. We're not going to get too much into that in this class. And it includes the timing of the cash flows. But where it really struggles is capital rationing and mutual exclusive projects where you have a choice between A or B. You know, I mean, the other thing I didn't talk about here is how many years the project is. If this one's 5 years and this one's 1 year and this one 2 years, not only do you get more NPV, but these projects, they're done in 1 or 2 years. You could do another project right after them versus project A. You can only do project A for 5 years. So you're kind of stuck with it. You see, there's just way too many things that you have to consider to come up with the optimal answer. So I don't think any firm has the optimal answer for any of these. It's just too complicated. I laugh when I read textbooks on finance and they say, oh, just do this. And they're like, yeah, you've not been in a real world, because it's never. Every textbook assumes every single project shows up on July 5th of every year, and you make a decision all at once with all these projects, and it's a mess. It's just Yeah, unequal lifespans, different costs, all those kind of things are this kind of payback. Really, most textbooks don't like payback. They say it's not really economic. Most firms like it because most CEOs don't trust accountants and finance majors because they don't trust our forecasts. They think they're too rosy. And so they say, at least give me a project that pays back fast. Because I know you're not a good forecaster in 2 years. You're really not a good forecaster 5 years out. So at least nearer term, I've got some hope this project makes sense because you're not forecasting out the next 10 years. You can read the class notes on those. We're not going to get into too much detail on those. IR, you're just trying to see, are you making more than your required return? Very similar to MPV. The textbooks almost always say MPV is better than IRR. Almost always, probably 100% of finance textbooks. And that's because of the reinvestment rate assumption. With net present value, it assumes any cash inflow you get, you reinvest at the cost of capital of the firm. IRR assumes any cash flow you get, you reinvest at the internal rate of return. So if your cost of capital is 7%, NPV assumes you're reinvesting at 7%. If your IRR is 72%, they're assuming any cash flow you get, you reinvest in another project making 72%, which is a pretty unreasonable assumption. Another issue you're going to have is future negative cash flows. I don't want any of your projects doing that because it really messes things up quite substantially. But negative future cash flows. So you have a negative cash flow at time 0 to invest in a project, then you have benefits. You don't want a negative number in the future. All right. And the reason that messes that up is IRR especially can give you some really bogus answers. It just messes up the math. NPV, the problem with NPV is the discount rate. When you have a negative future cash flow, if you use a higher discount rate, it actually reduces the impact of that negative cash flow, which is the opposite of what you want. You want a higher discount rate to mean you have more risk. But in this case, it actually reduces that negative cash flow. So it doesn't make sense. I have a solution for this, but I used to cover it, but you're not going to remember it anyway. And hopefully you won't have that issue. You can read my notes on that. All I want you to remember is if a project changes signs more than one time, it goes negative at time 0, positive, and another negative, you're going to have to do some special things to handle that project. You can't just do business as usual. What kind of project would have that? I think I mentioned one in an earlier class, but if you're doing a nuclear power plant, you spend $1 billion today, you get all these income from your rate customers are, and then in 50 years you got to decommission that plant because you have all this radiation you got to deal with. That can be billions and billions of dollars. That project doesn't work well in this context. But we have students working with nuclear power plants, and yeah, we got one student alum, Rafa. He's up in Utah right now, but he's moving up fast, and he does nuclear power plants. He does turbines, solar, oil, and that is his job, is to do cost benefit analysis on these projects. So I wish I could have him come talk to class. It'd be really interesting. So he did what I hope he will do. He had this job. He's there just a few months, and his boss left. And so they need to go hire a new manager. And he goes to his boss's boss and says, I'll take the job. And they're like, you don't have enough experience. So give me a shot. They gave it to him. He did great. And so he like jumped 3 spaces like overnight, and he's done great. So he's a great UTSA alum. All right. So how do you get these costs and benefits for your project? So you're going to have to do this for your project. One key here that you all want to think about is we're doing this in cash flows. It's not accounting. It's not net income. It's cash flows. And it's incremental cash flows. So incremental cash flow means what's your cash flow if you do the project versus if you don't do the project. And you want to think of everything you could possibly have to put into that. It can include taxes. We're ignoring taxes for your project because it really messes things up. If you're an accounting or finance major, you're doing a project, you should do what I did on taxes. my good friend Amy was head of the tax department at USAA. So anytime I had a project, I just went to Amy and said, here's my project. And her department was really, really good. And they would do all the work for me and just say, here's your cash flows. And I didn't have to do that work because I didn't want to have to look. Y'all have how I heard of maker tables, you accountants. So Peyton, you're probably doing that, right?
No,
Did you say tax or auditing?
audit.
Oh, audit. Okay, you wouldn't care. All right. So anybody knows what a maker table is? Y'all talked about it in the class. So the IRS has special tables for depreciating for tax purposes. So they're usually like double declining or something. So not straight line. Y'all remember straight line depreciation? You just divide by the number of years. The IRS allows you to depreciate faster than that for taxes. It depends on the actual equipment that you're buying. They're not all the same tables. So that's why I went to the tax department and says, here's a project I'm doing. Tell me the tax implications. And I've had sometimes they'll come back with a 16-page report. Like, here's all the implications. But they do all the work and they loved it. She had this research department that was just phenomenal. They actually enjoy doing that kind of work. And they would come back. And so we're ignoring taxes just because of that, because it is really, really quite expensive to figure that out. So you also on taxes, you have to worry about timing. So we're going to talk a little bit about timing, but you notice you're putting a specific date in there. For taxes, if you know exactly when you pay taxes, you put the date. So corporations pay taxes not April 15th, but when? So March, and then every 3 months, March, April, May, June, whatever the dates are. But March 15th instead of April 15th is when they file. And then they pay every 3 months. So you'd want to line that up as precisely as you can. So you're not doing GAAP net income. You're doing everything on a cash basis, which is actually to me a lot easier because you don't have to worry about depreciation and all those kind of other things. So the relevant cash flows are those cash flows in terms of what do you look like if you do the project and not do the project, and that includes inflation. This is something some of you are going to forget to do, but write it in your notes. You want to inflate your numbers. If you're doing a franchise, your revenues are going to grow with inflation. Your employees' pay is going to grow with inflation. Every single one of your projects, you're going to have an inflation assumption in there. You saw that in the project we did for the cash handling. And it has to be incremental. That includes avoided costs. So if I do this project, I won't have to do this. So that savings is an incremental. If you replace the machine, you don't have to buy a new machine in 3 years. If you outsource this function, you won't have to hire two new employees 4 years from now when your volumes grow higher. This building that I'm doing this in, if I do this project, what will it do for me? It'll be lease out that space to somebody else. On marketing projects, you got to be careful that, hey, if I do this promotion and this product does really, really well, you might have another product that's doing worse because your customers are buying A instead of B. You have to put that into your analysis as well. Relevant costs, and this one we're going to talk probably after the break. I'm going to have to convince you of this. Relevant costs do not include financing costs. So you don't have to do any mortgages. If you're buying a car, you assume you buy it. And everybody get this in your notes. If you're buying a building, buying a car, you assume you pay for it 100% on day zero in cash. No debt. I'm going to prove to you why that's the right answer. And some of you are thinking, well, he's saying that just to keep it simple, but that's not true. That's true no matter what you're doing. In any context, you do the project assuming it's all on the cash basis. Now you say, yeah, but I might borrow cash. That's fine. You still do it on an all cash basis. Why? Because your discount rate already assumes you're borrowing. It's already in the number. I'm going to show you why that's the case mathematically, but I don't want to do it today. I want to do it when we have a little more time to talk about it. So do everything as if you're borrowing. You're doing it 100% in cash. Any kind of investment earnings and those kind of things, you don't have to do that. You don't have to say, wow, this project gives me $5,000 that I can go buy a CD earning 4%. You don't do that. That's already in your discount rate. That discount rate covers a lot of stuff. It was funny. I had a project the real estate company, they love me because I fought hard to keep real estate. And so they come to me with their projects. And they came to me with a lease buyback project. Lease buybacks are ridiculous projects. They're almost done entirely for tax reasons. But they came to me and they had this massive net present value. I was like, there's no way this has a massive net present value. Well, the reason it did is because they were assuming any cash inflow they got, they could reinvest in the project. So let me show you what they're doing. They're saying year one, we get $10 million. And we're going to invest that and make 6%. So we make another 600,000 bucks. So they were showing, hey, the project brings in 10 million bucks and we're going to make another 600,000 bucks on it. There's a serious problem with this. So that's the cash inflow, right? Y'all agree with that? 10 million came in. And then they made 600,000 on that 10 million. How did I make 600,000 on the 10 million? If you buy an investment, how do you do it? So you have $1 million and you want to invest it. Do you get to keep your $1 million and invest it? What do you have to do with that $1 million? Don't you have to send it to your company that you're buying the investment from? What were they forgetting to do? They're forgetting that 10 million went out the door to buy the investment to get them 6%. Essentially, they were saying we invested $10 million and we got to keep the $10 million. Okay, you can't do that. They left out the negative $10 million cash flow to buy the investment. What we do is just ignore that. We count the $10 million and our discount rate assumes you're going to invest that $10 million at 6%. So you have to just trust me, the discount rate already captures that. When we made that adjustment, their net present value went from like $50 million to like 600,000 bucks. And they're really upset. But I was like, they wanted me to sign off on it. I was like, I'm not signing off on that. There's no way. Sunk costs, if you already spent the money, you can't get that back. So, you know, if it's in the past, it's already gone. If you're trying to figure out that we spend another $10 million to finish this project, we've already spent 20. Well, your decision is, does that $10 million make sense? If you've already spent the 20, that's lost. You can't do anything about that. We already talked about allocated costs. There's costs that you get allocated to you that don't go away if you do the project. It's just your firm has to spread these costs out. Those you don't include. That's not gonna matter. Which of these are going to affect you? Well, this one definitely. These first two, you're going to see it makes your project much easier to do if you ignore those first two, which is what you're supposed to do anyway. So it saves you a lot of time. At least one of your projects is going to mess up on this, and we'll have to fix it when we meet. We talked about taxes. We're not going to do taxes. When I took accounting undergraduate, we did cost benefit analysis where we had to do the tax side. I thought it was a waste of time. And why might that be? What's the problem with learning a lot of details about the US tax code? Why would you find that to be a kind of a waste of time? They change how often? Pretty constantly, right? So why learn the tax code when it's going to change? So I had the best tax professor undergraduate. Do y'all take corporate tax? The accountants probably do. Well, I had the best guy. He was, he called everything those rascals, but other than that, a really good professor. But he focused more on the theory of the tax code versus just memorizing a lot of details. And that has stuck with me since. I understand how the tax code, what the IRS is trying to accomplish, but I don't have a bunch of rules memorized, and that's really what you want. So there's really no benefit to you memorizing a lot of inertia, unless you're an accounting major and you want to be a tax accountant the rest of your life. But even then, the tax rules change a bunch. That's why tax accounting professors, they have a huge advantage. They get to write a new textbook every year, make a lot more money off of that because the tax law keeps changing dramatically. But you do use the marginal tax rate if you're making a decision, not the effective tax rate. We're going to talk about this with each one of your projects. How many years do you go out into the future? Every project's going to be different. So if I'm looking at buying a car, I want to do a plug-in hybrid. I can't go out 20 years because this car is probably not going to last 20 years. If I'm doing real estate, you almost have to go out 20, 30 years because there's no way you're going to buy a piece of real estate, rent it out, and get all your money back in 5 years. If I'm doing a franchise, 8 years is probably the shortest you can go. You probably need to go at least 10 years. Solar panels, we talked about that. You almost always have to go out 25 years. It takes about that long to get your money back. So each one of your projects will depend on what the project is and what you're looking at. So we'll talk about that with each of your projects and decide. We'll try to talk about all the benefits and costs. I'll try to give you some ideas. I've done enough of these projects that I might think of something you haven't thought of, but you want to try to think of everything that could impact you. I'm not going to talk about these. All right, so we talked about this a little bit earlier, but why don't you put the mortgage and those type of things into your project? If you're buying a car, why don't you put the car loan in there? And so what finance theory says is if you're trying to decide to buy a car, the first decision you make is the car itself a good decision? You do that on a cash basis. Once you decide that the car is a good decision, then you decide how you're going to finance it. So we don't like to mix what we say financing and purchase decisions. You do the purchase decision first, decide whether the project makes sense or not, and then you talk about the financing and how you're going to finance it. That's the second step. Yeah, I saw this article. I don't know if it's still available on CNN, but this guy is like the worst neighbor you could have. This guy, he bought a turbine for his backyard in a really nice neighborhood. Can you imagine just how horrible that is? But he said he could save $20 a month on his power bill. You get a tax credit for $3,000, and it costs him $50,000. So let's do the net present value on that. So today, y'all remember how do you do the day? Today, yeah. And then what do? Parentheses, all right. And then we're going to go out 183 days. And then when we already go out. First year, you go out 6 months. Next year, you want to be where? 365. We can do 0.25 if you want to. And he said, if even it takes me 50 years, I'm going to do it. I don't know what 50 years is, but 74. Even if it takes me 74 years, I'm going to do it. So he's going to spend $12,000 at time zero, and he's going to make $20 a month. And let's give him inflation. So by the 50th year, he's saving $646 a year. And he says, even if it takes me 50 years, I'm going to do this project. What do you think the net present value of this project is? So what rate do we want to use? Let's use 7%. The values, there they are right there. The dates. How did he do? His payback is more than 50 years. So he said, even if it takes me 50 years, I'm going to do it. Well, bad news, Mr. Man, but it's going to take you more than 50 years. You're going to have to save a whole lot more than. Would you put a big turbine in your backyard to save $20 a month and spend $12,000 for it? It doesn't even make sense on the surface. So I read this article, and when I read the article, that's the first thing that hit my mind is I don't think he sat down in Excel to calculate that. I can see solar panels, but a turbine, that's kind of getting a little crazy. But anyway, you know, this is something I hope y'all start doing. When I see articles like that, I sit down and start doing the math. Have they thought through what they're doing?
Can we do one? It was per
week. Well, we can see. You think it's $20 per week?
And if it wanted.
So we can try it. Yeah, that would be enough. $20 a week would be enough. $1,000 savings. Yep. When I did my plug-in hybrid, that's what I had to figure out because I really wasn't sure what my electric bill was going to do. My math that I calculated was going to go up about $9 a month, but I really wasn't sure. And then here I am 4 years later, and I can't even tell a difference. So it doesn't seem higher. I know I'm saving $50 a month on gasoline, but I thought I was going to spend an extra $9 a month on electricity, but I just haven't noticed it. So it just feels like I'm saving $50 a month. So sometimes you don't really know until you get, and I think that's the problem with solar panels. I think most people on solar panels, they're surprised they're not saving as much as they thought they would. I think with him, he's probably, I mean, he's got some other issues over 50 years because a lot of things can happen in 50 years to a solar panel, right? So you may have some maintenance that you hadn't thought about. So, all right. So what we want to do now is we're going to do some team exercises. So team picks your CBA. So let's talk about what we're looking for here. Have any of your teams talked through it yet? Anybody have ideas? All right, so it has to be something that's interesting and not obvious. All right, I've had some cases that are way too obvious. There was one that did the kiosk medical office. So we spend $3,000 or $2,000 on a PC as a kiosk if that would eliminate one staff position. So we spend $3,000 today to save us $40,000 a year. What's the payback on that? It's a couple of weeks. Do you really need to do a cost benefit analysis of that? Doesn't really do much for you. It needs to be interesting and not obvious. This is probably the most important one, is it needs to have access to reliable data. That's going to be probably one thing you want to really talk about it. So franchises work really well, but not all of them equally. So like I said, Chick-fil-A doesn't work because it's hard to get the data. McDonald's works pretty well, you got the data. Subway, you can get pretty good data, although we know Subway is kind of a declining. Others of them, it's hit or miss. So if you talk about a franchise today, you might come up with a list of 3 or 4. And once the exam's behind you, start looking and see who has good data. What I will tell you on franchises, what a lot of them will do, they'll provide you some data, like Smoothie King, some data, but to get all the data, you got to register with them, and then they're going to send you all this stuff. They're looking for people that want to actually buy a franchise. And so what they do is they hold back the information. Now, some franchises that worked really well last semester, one was a massage. They did massages and they sold teas. I forget the name of it. I have to look that one up. They were able to find all the data, and it was really fascinating. I had trouble believing it was as good as they said it was, but all their data looked right. I emailing on that's place is called. I don't know if they have too many of them here in San Antonio, but
Is
it
it
was
like Massage Eyes?
I don't, that name doesn't sound familiar. It was a real yuppie thing, if y'all know what a yuppie is, but it's the kind of place I would never go to because I buy my clothes at Walmart, but it was pretty kind of high end, high skill kind of place. Have to have good data, need to be able to do sensitivity. So what that means is there's got to be at least one factor you're really unsure about that's material to the project. So for me, with buying a plug-in hybrid, part of my issue was how many miles am I going to drive? And that's one I missed because I used to drive 10,000 miles a year, and now I only drive about 6,000. So because I ride my bike a lot more places than I used to. So I ride my bike 10,000 miles, but I drive my car 6,000 miles. So I wasn't really sure, but I had a lot of historical data that I draw on. I might be unsure about gas prices going forward, and that I could do the test on that. What most people do on a EV or gas is gas. You can get a lot of history and look at the volatility. Electricity is pretty predictable. Electricity doesn't usually jump up and down radically, so they tend to use a fairly constant number for electricity and let the gasoline be the one they do the sensitivity on. So that can be there. You need some good intangibles because that's going to be part of your presentation. I don't know how to spell intangibles, but Bill Gates probably does. And intangibles, ignore what your accounting class said. We're not talking about intangible assets. That's a completely separate thing. We're talking about those costs and benefits that you don't have in dollars in your project. Those advantages and disadvantages of doing that. That's where you need someone really researching that. So I don't know how to break this up. Can y'all get in the groups and start debating it? And then ask me questions. Does that make sense? I'd love for you to decide this week, at least the category what you're gonna work on. So like if you decide on a franchise and you don't know which one, at least decide if it's gonna be food or something else. Any questions right now? So you can ask me questions. We can also do some quick research on the fly here to see if we can actually get the project going, all right? One last thing I would say is not too complicated. So if you have a team member that says, hey, I got this project at work, I'd love to do this here, and none of you have a clue what they're saying, don't do that project. I've had 3 or 4 projects like that, but I had one team, it was a city and they wanted to change their ambulance service. And the guy actually doing the project didn't understand what he's talking about. And they couldn't, I was like, I'm not a stupid person. And I still have no clue what you're trying to figure out. It was just way too complicated. So make sure that your team understands the project. All right, break into teams. If you want to spread out a little bit more so you don't talk over each other, that's fine.